So, I think that there are two stories that you can tell about the state of the solar market today. Unfortunately, the first one is decidedly negative, and nowhere is it more apparent than in the public markets, where solar has basically been eviscerated since the beginning of 2016. If you look at just an aggregate of solar, pure play solar stocks, it's down about 40% since the beginning of 2016. It recovered a little bit just over the past few weeks, but not a whole lot. And of course, stock prices in public markets are not always the greatest indicator of the health of a market. But in this case, I think they do say something about something that's going on in solar right now, which is that many companies have had a tough year or year and a half. In particular, it's been hard for module manufacturers, right? And this has been true especially in the second half of 2016 through basically today. Basically what happened to module manufacturers is a tale of two halves in 2016. Let's see if we can get this slide to work. There we go. So the change between the first half and the second half of last year was pretty stark, and it went in two different ways. First of all, between the first half and the second half of last year, global demand for solar fell by 16%. This is despite the fact that we were having a banner year for solar overall. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But China pulled back on its feed-in tariff program at the end of the first half of the year. That resulted in a big contraction in the Chinese market in the second half of the year. And despite the fact that we saw a lot of growth in the US and India and in some other markets, the global market shrank in that 6-month period. But as has been the case many times in solar, and this is a cycle we tend to repeat, broadly speaking, module manufacturers, panel manufacturers, had not gotten the message in time. And so they continued to expand capacity. And so over that 6-month period, panel manufacturers expanded their capacity globally by 10%. So what happens when you have a shrinking market and increasing capacity at the same time? You get thrown into oversupply. And that's what happened at the second half of 2016. And the result of that, of course, as is generally the case in an oversupply situation, is that prices crashed. They ended up falling almost 40% just over the course of 2016, mostly in the second half. And though they've somewhat stabilized in 2017, for the most part, they remain pretty well depressed. So, as a result, we remain in an oversupply cycle for panel manufacturing, and panel manufacturers have suffered as a result. Their margins have compressed, and they've had to figure out sort of how to survive through the downturn. Now, normally, when you have oversupply in panel manufacturing, or this would be true if you have crashes in pricing for other components as well, that's bad for the manufacturers, but it's good for the downstream. It's good for anybody who's buying panels, anybody who's developing projects, if you're an EPC, and so on. And indeed, I think that was true for many companies in 2016 and through to today. We have a lot of developers that have benefited from that, but it's not universally true. And especially in the US, we've had a sort of simultaneous challenge specific to the residential solar market. So the residential market in the US was booming for years. From 2012 through 2015, 4 years in a row, the residential solar market grew by over 50% a year. And then in 2016, it started to slow down. We saw a 19% growth last year. And all indications are that 2017 is basically going to be flat overall for residential solar. A lot of this is due to California alone. California is not only going through a transition to its second iteration of net energy metering, switching to time of use rates, but also in the first quarter of this year had unprecedented rains that made it basically impossible for a lot of that quarter to get people up on the roof. So California has been a down market for residential solar, while the rest of the country has sort of gone flat at the moment. And the result of this, broadly speaking, has been hardest on the largest residential solar companies, with one notable exception, which is Sunrun, the CEO of whom is coming up on stage next. But the exception of them, basically everybody else has dialed back on growth, and in some cases, you've seen even more drastic impacts. So if you combine, over the last 16 months or so, the impact of the oversupply on upstream companies, and here in the US, the sort of slow growth, and in some cases flatlining of the residential solar market, you've ended up having a lot of negative headlines. right? There have been bankruptcies from SunEdison last year to Sungevity to One Roof Energy to Solar World in Germany. So it's been sort of a rough time in the public eye for solar. And yet, I think that you only have to take kind of a small step backward to gain a little bit of perspective to recognize the milestones that the solar market, both in the US and globally, has simultaneously hit, despite some of the turmoil in individual companies, to recognize that we are at a really amazing point in the history of the solar market. When we look back at this time, 10, 20, 30 years from now, this is going to be a pivotal moment in solar becoming mainstream. And there are a lot of different ways in which this is true. First of all, despite the fact that we had a shrinking market in the second half of 2016, overall, the solar market globally grew by 53% last year. That's huge growth from a global perspective. We installed 78 gigawatts of solar. That's 10 times the amount that we installed in 2009. In the US, it was actually even more stark. The solar market in the US installed 14.5 gigawatts last year. That's up 95% over 2015. So the market basically doubled in this country last year. And for the first time ever, solar was the single largest source of new generating capacity in the US. We added more solar to the grid in this country than any other individual resource, more than wind, more than natural gas, more than coal, more than nuclear. That had never happened before. So we have all this massive growth. And in addition to that, within the US, the other thing that I think is important to note is that the sources of all this demand for solar are diversifying. So the way that we got to 14.5 gigawatts installed last year is not by just throwing a bunch of solar at a single type of market, but instead by opening up new avenues for procurement of solar, for demand for solar, and for the solar economics to work. So how did we do that? We had residential solar that was installed both through a third-party ownership model and directly owned by customers through a cash purchase or a lease. We had a commercial market, a non-residential market that had actually a fair bit of smaller commercial projects as well as larger commercial projects, and the emergence of a community solar sector, which is new. We have RPS-driven demand for utility scale in California and in other states, but in addition to that, we have new procurement mechanisms like PURPA, which is proliferating across a bunch of states, voluntary utility procurement, just because the economics work. We have utility-owned generation. We have corporates emerging as a new source of procurement. A lot of this came in the utility scale sector, obviously, in 2016. It was 2/3 of all the solar that we installed. But the point being, this is a diversifying market. If you had just looked at that same chart 2 years earlier at 2014, I think for the most part, you really only would have seen a couple of segments. If we can advance the slide here. I think the clicker may be out of gas. Okay. In 2014, if you had just looked at the same thing, we basically would have had a much more consolidated market. We're basically only installing third-party owned residential systems for the most part. Commercial only existed at larger scales. You couldn't get smaller commercial done. Community solar didn't really exist yet. And utility scale solar was basically only built out for states that had renewable portfolio standards. So we've come a long way since that point. In addition to that, I think the core point to make here is what has changed over the past few years that often goes unrecognized, which is a dramatic transformation in solar's economics relative to everything else. Back in 2010, if you wanted to build solar, first of all, it was an immature market. So utility scale solar had a wide range of pricing. Even within a single market, different projects had far different pricing. And if you wanted to make the economics work, you needed the federal incentive, you needed the investment tax credit. But that really wasn't sufficient if you wanted to compete. Certainly not if you wanted to compete with gas, in many cases if you wanted to compete with coal or wind. And so the way that we built solar back in the beginning of this decade was by stacking incentives. You needed the federal incentive, and then you needed something at the state level. You needed a federal, you needed a renewable portfolio standard, or in the case of DG, you needed tax credit or a rebate or something like that. That is, generally speaking, no longer true. Today, the cost of solar, even just taking the ITC into account, is highly competitive across most of the country with basically any other resource, with the exception of places that have a really high wind resource, where wind ends up being the cheapest in a lot of cases. Solar is often now the cheapest new source of generation. And in fact, that is becoming true even if you don't take the ITC into account. Certainly by the point when the ITC rolls off, assuming it continues as currently planned, we are going to be at a point where if you are a utility almost anywhere in this country, certainly a good swath of the country, and all you care about is getting the cheapest kilowatt hours from any source of generation, solar is going to win. And that is a dramatic transformation, something that basically I think the first 30 years of solar development in the US, we're aiming towards that point. So, despite some of the turmoil in the market, this is an inflection point for solar. And this isn't just sort of us making up numbers. There's lots of ways that you can look for proof points that this is true. Here's one example. Let's talk about Dominion. Dominion's a utility, right, based in Virginia, North Carolina. And Dominion submits, it's a vertically integrated utility, it submits an integrated resource plan every year to its regulators. So in that integrated resource plan, what Dominion and most other utilities are doing is they're basically running a model to determine, given their resource needs, expected cost of various sources of generation, what the least cost, best fit set of resources is going to be in their territory. They also model it out in a few different scenarios, including one that doesn't include the Clean Power Plan. So let's separate carbon, federal climate legislation from this question. So they're modeling this out basically based on economics. And if you look at their 2016 integrated resource plan, they were already planning to build out a bunch of solar in their territory over the next 15 years or so. So a little under a gigawatt by 2031, mix of assets that they would own and assets that they would procure power from. But they just a couple of weeks ago submitted their 2017 IRP, just 1 year later, running similar models, and the amount of solar more than quadrupled. They now expect, in a no Clean Power Plan scenario, to build mostly solar, more than any other resource by a long shot, and over 4 gigawatts just by 2031. If you extend it out to 2042, which is how far the IRP ultimately goes, it becomes more like 5 gigawatts. And here's what they said about it in the IRP. They said, basically, they explained that they added so much more solar into that plan due to the optimal economics, the fact that it has lower zero emissions, and importantly, the fact that the cost of solar, from their perspective, fell 24% between the time that they filed the 2016 IRP and the time that they were doing the analysis for the 2017 IRP. This is what happens when we get these drastic cost reductions for solar. It has a real meaningful impact on solar's competitiveness versus other sources of generation. And lest you think that Dominion is alone in this, there are a dozen vertically integrated utilities in the US in whose most recent integrated resource plans, they have suggested that they should build at least 0.5 gigawatt of solar in their territory. This, of course, is just the big vertically integrated utilities, right? And just among this dozen companies, they add up to about 20 gigawatts of utility-scale solar that they expect to build. Just by way of context, we have about 25 gigawatts of utility-scale solar operating in total. So just these 12 utilities, if their IRPs go through and they act upon all of it, they would nearly double the size of the cumulative utility-scale solar market in the US. This is 12 utilities. We have 3,000 in the US. So this is a very real transformation. And it's not just in the US. It's actually a global phenomenon as well. If you look at where power purchase agreement prices have been coming in globally, they've obviously been declining with the cost of solar, but they've really gotten low, almost everywhere. Average PPA prices globally are now below 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Worth noting that basically all these markets are unsubsidized, so there's no ITC in most of these places. These are just pure solar prices. And it's sort of happening everywhere. There are all these, there's a race for the next record for the lowest power purchase agreement price that keeps happening. We'll get probably the lowest one again in the next couple of months. But it's across multiple regions. We have a sub $30 megawatt hour price in the UAE. We've got another one at about $30 in Mexico. In India, we're down to about $40 a megawatt hour. India has been historically a much more expensive market for solar. So if these projects are real, this is a notable change. And again, the point here is not that these individual projects are so cheap. It's that, broadly speaking, this is the pricing for big utility scale solar projects in most of the world. And that, again, makes solar competitive with and oftentimes better than, from an economic perspective, any other source of generation at that time. And so the result globally has been that countries all over the world are introducing tender processes, introducing auction schemes, something where they procure competitive pricing from solar developers. We now have some form of auction or tender scheme in over 60 countries, either already in place or planned. So this is a global phenomenon. But despite all this growth, despite the fact that we're adding so much new solar to the grid, it comprises a big portion of all the new capacity that we add in the US as well as globally, and the fact that prices are so low now, we have a huge mountain to climb for solar to become a meaningful chunk of electricity, both in the US and in the rest of the world. Right now, solar accounts for about 2% or so of electricity generation in this country, and that's actually roughly the same globally. So we're growing a lot, but from a small base, and we're eating into a gigantic market for power generation. So there is a long way to go. So what does that mean, right? If there's a true paradigm shift here, and increasingly as time goes on across more locations, solar is going to be the cheapest new source of electricity, full stop, then what are the questions that emerge? Because it doesn't mean that we end there and we've won. There's a lot still to be figured out. First of all, there's a short-term question that pertains just to the US, and I would be remiss not to mention it, but we'll talk more about it later. And that is the possibility that actually solar doesn't keep getting cheaper, at least in the short term, in the US. There is a petition that's been filed by Suniva, which is a Georgia-based solar manufacturer, that as part of its bankruptcy proceeding, filed a trade petition essentially requesting from the president, ultimately, remedies against imports of solar cells and modules. And we're going to have a whole session on this later this morning. We'll talk through the process, potential impacts, and so on. So I'm not going to get into it too much right now, but I will say this. We estimate that about 13% of the solar modules that were installed in the US last year were manufactured in the US last year. That means that about 87% of the market could potentially be subject to whatever remedies are imposed, if indeed they are imposed. So it could have a big impact on module supply in the US. And indeed, it could have a big impact on pricing. Here's where actual spot prices have gone for sort of large volume orders of top-tier Chinese manufactured panels in the US, down in the 30 to 40 cent range. I've even heard quotes now that are below 30 cents. And what Suniva is requesting, though what they get could be nothing or entirely different, what they're requesting is a 78 cent per watt minimum price in addition to a 40 cent a watt tariff on cells. So imagine that pricing just goes straight to that minimum, the bare minimum price. That would be pricing levels that we have not seen in the US since 2012. So in terms of module pricing, it would drive us back 5 years. So that obviously could have a big impact on the economics of solar in the US. But we don't know where that's going. It's entirely possible that the numbers could be different or that nothing could happen. So let's set that aside for the moment, and we'll talk about it later today. And let's assume that solar does continue to get cheaper and cheaper, and that it becomes the least cost resource for kilowatt hours in much of this country and much of the world. Well, then you start to come up with another set of issues. And I think they are well represented by a chart that I'm sure many of you are sick of seeing at this point, which is the duck curve. First of all, I'll just make a point. This is real data. What you're used to seeing typically is the California ISO created this chart, right? And the chart is basically designed to show net load, which means how much demand is there for generation when you take out all of the must-run zero-cost resources, solar and wind. So as time goes on, you get more and more solar on the California grid. It generates more and more in the middle of the day, and that means there's less and less demand for everything else. Meanwhile, the sun sets in the evening, and demand goes back up for everything else. That's the duck curve. Most of the time, you're used to seeing a theoretical version of the duck curve that the California ISO put out a few years ago. This is real data from an average April day and our projections out to 2026. And it's a real duck curve. It looks very ducky. So it's a real thing, right? And I think the reason that it's worth talking about is that it represents a coming set of challenges that we're going to have to figure out how to deal with as solar penetration increases as a result of solar becoming the most economic resource. So the first challenge that the duck curve presents comes in the middle of the day, right? You have more and more solar generation. You can get to a point pretty quickly when you have overgeneration. That can result in curtailment, which is bad from an economic perspective, and it can result in depressed and oftentimes negative pricing in the wholesale markets. This indeed is already happening in California, right? We've seen it this spring where it's been particularly stark because a mixture of the fact that we've added a bunch more solar to the grid in California and the fact that it was such a rainy winter means there's a lot of hydro, which is also a must-run resource. So we've had record negative pricing in wholesale markets in California and record curtailment. So that's a challenge because it means the more solar you put on the grid, if everything else stays equal, the less value the next bit of solar has, because you're still generating at the times when it becomes less and less needed. It's the declining marginal value of solar. So that's one challenge you have to face. The second one comes in the evening, right? Sun sets, everybody comes home, they turn on their air conditioners, they run their dishes, whatever they do, and peak comes generally after the sun has set. And so you have this big evening ramp requirement from the time when solar is generating the most to the time when it's generating none and the peak happens. So that represents a second challenge. And the result of this, I think, is going to change the paradigm of how we think about electricity and the way that we build up a generation mix in the US. With all due respect to our Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry, who has issued this request for a memo from the DOE in a ridiculous 60 days to determine basically whether renewables, and specifically in this case subsidies for renewables, are hurting baseload power, I think that's the wrong question to ask. The question is not, is it hurting baseload power? The question we are going to be facing is, what is the source of flexibility on the grid? Because as we get more and more abundant, low-cost, variable renewables, solar and wind, what you need to fill in the gaps is flexibility. You need resources that can ramp quickly, and in an ideal world, you need to figure out a solution to avoid things like overgeneration. So flexibility is a word that has started to proliferate a little bit in electricity circles, and I think it's going to become a buzzword for the next few years. You're going to hear a lot about the need for flexibility. And indeed, grid operators are already thinking about this. In California, the ISO basically thinks that 3-hour upward ramp, the time in a spring day between highest source of solar generation and peak, is almost going to double between 2015 and 2019. And as a result, they basically need a similar increase in the amount of flexible capacity on the grid. We've modeled this out for Texas, where you have a lot of wind already, and we're adding a lot of solar, and we think at a bare minimum you're going to need triple the flexible capacity in 2035 that you needed in 2016. There's a real need for some form of flexibility. So, what does this mean for solar? First, it's worth noting that we talk about the duck curve a lot. It is largely just a California phenomenon today because California has the highest penetration of solar of anywhere in this country. One, I think, decent benchmark for when do you have to start thinking about this kind of challenge is, roughly speaking, when solar gets to about 10% of electricity load, then you start to see duck curve-like phenomena. So as of 2016, only California and Nevada were at that point already, and Nevada, of course, selling a lot of that power into California. So this was a pretty California-specific phenomenon. We have a few other states in the southeast, or southwest rather, that were approaching that point. If you look out a few years, our forecast calls for solar penetration nationally to grow from a little under 2%, as I said last year, to about 5.5%. So that's a dramatic increase by 2022. But it's going to be relatively concentrated amongst the major solar states, which means that you still aren't going to have a ton of states that are facing a duck curve-like challenge. But you will have some. You'll have a few states that are already above 20% penetration of solar, certainly California, but potentially a couple of others. You'll have a number of states, including some in the Northeast, that are up over 10%, and then a bunch of states that are sort of emerging as the next set of high penetration markets. This is all to say, let's not overstate the proximity of the duck curve challenge across the entire country, but let's also recognize that it's not that far into the future. So, what does that mean? Well, I think it raises the question of what do you need to do in order to continue having solar grow? If we're at the point where solar is competitive today, what's it going to take to keep it competitive for the next 10, 20, 30 years? And I think it requires a few things to all happen. The first is solar has to keep getting cheaper. I think there's this notion that some people have that solar had to get cost competitive. We had to hit grid parity. And that once we hit grid parity, we're done, right? Solar has achieved what it set out to achieve and will continue to grow forevermore. And I don't think that's probably what's going to happen, in part because the more solar you put on the grid, the less value it's going to have on its own, and that means that it has to continually get cheaper to outrun its value decline. So solar has to keep getting lower and lower cost. So how do you do that? Well, I really like the Sunshot Initiative's example of this, right? The Sunshot Initiative is the DOE initiative. We have the head of Sunshot Initiative up on stage a little later this morning. Initially, in 2012, Sunshot Initiative set out a target for solar for 2020, right? And that was supposed to be basically as a benchmark for utility scale solar, $1 a watt fully installed, or about 6 cents per kilowatt hour for a project in the Southwest. And indeed, we've hit that, and in fact, we've hit it early. So Sunshot more recently said, okay, what's the next target? So now they're setting out to 2030, and they're saying, how do we get from what their 2016 benchmark was, about 7 cents a kilowatt hour, reality being even a little lower than that today, again with no incentives, to a sort of sustainable 3 cent per kilowatt hour solar cost for utility scale solar, and then they have different numbers for distributed solar by 2030. What does it take to get there? They have some, I think, pretty reasonable assumptions built in there. Aggressive, to say the least, but possible. The way that you get there is by reducing panel costs down to 30 cents a watt, fixed and with no import tariffs, presumably. You reduce balance of system costs by 30 cents a watt over that period. You get a 50-year lifetime solar project that is bankable with a 0.2% per year degradation. And you drop O&M costs by 2/3, roughly. So those are ambitious targets, right? You've got until 2030 to get all these things done if you want solar to be 3 cents a kilowatt hour at that point, which means that everybody in this room, many of you are the solar innovators that can make this happen, have to continue to push on cost and on performance and on lifetime. But even that on its own probably isn't sufficient, right? Because you can get really cheap solar on the grid and you can keep adding more and more of it, but you're still going to face this overgeneration problem in the middle of the day, and you're still going to face the ramp in the evening. So the duck curve doesn't get solved by very cheap solar. That just lets you keep building more and more because it has enough value relative to its cost. So what else do you need? First, expanded grids, right? This is one of the solutions that the Southwest is looking at, or the West in general, the energy imbalance market. Basically, the wider your geographic array through which you are trading electricity, the better off you are. The more resources that you've got within your trading area, the better off that you are. The more you have diversity of resources, the easier it is to manage the peaks and valleys of any given resource, including solar, but also including wind. So you need transmission to take these resources from the places where they are cheapest to the places where there's demand, but you also just need the markets to expand. That's also a partial solution. I don't think that's a full solution on its own. You still need flexibility. I think there's one bucket of solutions to the flexibility challenge that you might call traditional resource flexible capacity. The incumbent answer to this question right now in most markets, if you say, well, we're going to add a lot of solar to the grid and we need something to ramp up in the evening, it's probably going to be natural gas. Right? Natural gas is currently our most flexible, dispatchable resource that can ramp up and down pretty quickly depending on the design of the generator. There's also some people will make an argument that over the long term, if you have sort of major carbon constraints, that maybe the next generation of nuclear reactor could be flexible, or that even something like coal with carbon capture could serve that purpose. Now, of course, both of those far more unproven from both the technological and an economic standpoint, but they all fall into this bucket of sort of traditional resources in one way or another providing the solution to flexibility. But they're not alone. And there's this emerging suite of next-generation flexibility solutions, which is, I think, where the solar industry and adjacent industries have paid a lot of attention and are investing heavily over the past few years for good reason. That would be energy storage, which takes generation from one time of the day or one time of the week or one time of the month and shifts it to another time. Or it could be electric vehicles, which soak up demand in the middle of the day if electricity pricing is right and if the charging capabilities are there. Or even in a vehicle-to-grid type situation, electric vehicles acting as storage on the grid. Or demand response, which initially was there to solve critical peak challenges, right? So we would have demand response events very rapid or rarely. But it's evolving quickly to a point where it's customers' loads adapting to fluctuations in needs from the grid via price response. So all these things can also provide flexibility. And I think they're coming faster than certainly many of the incumbents recognize. I'll give you one example, which is in South Australia. So South Australia has made some news recently, but for anybody who isn't familiar with what's been going on there, South Australia has added a lot of wind to the grid, a fair amount of solar as well, but really a ton of wind. And earlier this year had some really painful blackouts on the grid. In part because they had so much wind, but also there were some rules. There was a storm, it shut down some of the lines, and for some people in South Australia, there was a 13-day blackout. So that made news in Australia, but of course it hit the more broad public eye when Elon Musk tweeted about it, which is how we know things are important in this sector. So Elon Musk tweets about it and says energy storage can solve this problem, and now all of a sudden there's a bunch of energy storage getting developed in South Australia. So we wanted to ask this question of, well, what could energy storage do on the South Australia grid, and how could it manage this flexibility challenge? So we modeled out what it might look like in 2025 in South Australia with pretty conservative assumptions. So here's a February day. This is all the generation. The dotted line at the bottom is the net load, so that's what the duck curve would normally look like. Everything on top of that is all the generation from renewables. So you have, at that point, using extremely conservative assumptions, in reality, there's probably going to be more solar and more wind at that point. But being conservative, about 4.5 gigawatts of wind, 1.5 gigawatts of solar on the grid. So here's your duck curve challenge. In the evening, as solar generation decreases, wind generation doesn't really pick up all that much. And so the result is that what South Australia has to rely upon is imports, which are pretty expensive, and gas peakers. So what if you just wanted to use energy storage to replace the gas peakers and the imports? What would that take? It's actually not all that much. What you could do at that point is, because you have overgeneration of wind during the day, you charge your energy storage with the curtailed wind, you feed that into the grid in the evening, and all it would take in order to completely displace the peakers and the imports is about 400 megawatts of energy storage, 4-hour duration roughly. Just by way of context, 400 megawatts of energy storage is not that much. There's already 100 megawatts getting built in South Australia now. To imagine that you can get to 400 megawatts by 2025 is not crazy at all. And so as a result, you have no imports at all, and there's no need for a peaking generator. This is one of the reasons why I don't think it's crazy to imagine that gas peakers, or peakers in general, are going to be an endangered resource on the grid before too long. Energy storage, and to a lesser extent demand response, can replace that need in many cases, and as the costs fall, they will be the most economic resource to do that. So that's an energy storage example, but the next thing that's coming up is flexible demand, right? This is what can the customer do, because if the customer, in many places, at the residential level and at the commercial level, starts to have all this stuff that is controllable. We have generators, maybe, from rooftop solar, or controllable generators from a fuel cell or CHP. We've got electric vehicles. We can decide when to charge. We might have the ability to store with electric vehicles. We've got load controllers, smart thermostats. We control it all automated on our phones or behind the scenes. And you have all this stuff. You can do something with it above and beyond just save yourself money on power. And so that requires getting the market mechanisms right, getting the technologies right, and evolving especially how we price electricity in order to make sure that the price signals are sent to the customer at the right time to do the right thing. But in addition to that, I think in order for this sort of idyllic future of the customer as a flexible demand resource to play out, we also need to evolve how we value distributed energy resources. And it's a utility question, largely. You know, utilities are used to looking at generators and saying, okay, what can you do for me in the three main areas that I think about? How much energy can you provide? Can you provide capacity? Can you provide ancillary services? That's a traditional way to think about the value of a generator. Over the past few years in the US, in some places, we've started to ask this question of what is the value of solar, right? And that adds a few components to the question. It says, okay, in addition to what value can solar provide in those normal areas, can it provide some form of a grid service? Can it avoid transmission distribution? Can it avoid line losses? And is it a hedge against volatile fuel prices where solar has none? In addition, there are some non-economic economic benefits that sometimes get taken into account. That is a good step in the right direction, but ultimately, you need to get to a point where you're asking what the locational value of these resources is. This is where utilities can say, all right, I expect that I'm going to need to upgrade this substation. It's going to cost me $1 billion. Can a portfolio of distributed energy resources defer that upgrade or make it so that the upgrade is not needed at all? And can it do it cheaper? And that's a locational question, right? And that's a hard question to answer en masse. So we're already starting to see a fair bit of this. This is the notion of non-wires alternatives for utilities. We've seen more of that this year already proposed from utilities in the US than all previous years combined. So this is starting to happen, but it does require more sophisticated methods of understanding how the grid should function in a world that is highly distributed. So that's another challenge that's faced by this market as we figure out how to evolve from one that's just sort of fighting to get economic to one that needs to proliferate up to a much larger scale. So we have all these opportunities, all these long-term challenges in the market. There is still a fair bit of tumult amongst many of the solar companies. But I hope that we can all sort of take a step back and recognize what the prize looks like. The prize may be something like this. Right now, we're at about 2% solar penetration globally. Just imagine, we've been modeling this out, imagine solar is going to get to about 17% by 2035. That's not an unreasonable number, I think, given the cost trajectory, given the opportunity, given the need for electricity generation globally. If that is true, we're going to go from a market that right now is about $87 billion a year in just sort of money that goes into solar projects to one that's about $250 billion a year. And over that period, we would install 3 terawatts, 3,000 gigawatts of solar, and invest about $2.8 trillion. The prize is enormous, and it's not crazy to imagine that this is how this market is going to play out. So if we can all just sort of maintain some perspective and figure out the ways to innovate in manners that allow solar to continue to grow, there is enormous opportunity here. And this is the right place to be to figure out where to seize that opportunity and how to partner with others to do so. With that, I thank you for your time.